Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to share some tips about how to go from phonics to fluency in a K-2 classroom. Now, there are many different parts to fluency, and we know that research has shown that there's a strong correlation between expressive oral reading and silent reading comprehension. So we know that we need our students to become fluent readers, but how we go about doing that can be just a little bit tricky. So in this video, I want to share a little more information about what fluency is and what it is not, and I have 3 easy tips for you to implement in your classroom that will help your students become fluent readers. If you're ready to see what these tips are, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's get started. Alright, before I dive into the different parts of fluency, let's talk about what fluency is not. Fluency is not fast reading. Now, I think most teachers know that on some level, that we know that in order to be a fluent reader, we don't just need to read quickly, but we do know that reading quickly is part of being fluent. So therefore, it can be a little confusing when you're thinking about what types of activities to give your students. We also know that there are assessments teachers use, like oral reading fluency, and that advanced great readers have a high oral reading fluency. They can read more words per minute than less proficient readers. Knowing that research, it can be a little tricky for teachers because we do need our students to read more quickly, or our students that have a low oral reading fluency, we know we need them to get them to read a little bit faster, but we want to make sure that we don't conflate reading quickly and fluency as one thing. It is a small component of fluency, but there are many other pieces to it, so it's just one little piece of the puzzle. With that little reminder out of the way, I do want to share the 3 main parts of fluency. First, we have accuracy, and accuracy is always going to be our #1 most important thing we need for our students to become fluent readers. Because of course, if they are not able to accurately decode a word, they're not going to understand what it means. So we have accuracy, we have reading rate, and that's going to be, the speed at which students read, and it needs to be an appropriate speed. It does not need to be super fast. And we also have expression. Now, researchers have taken these 3 categories and they have broken them into subcategories, but these are the 3 main ones. So under accuracy, you have things like automatic word recognition. You have self-correction measures. Under reading rate, this is really where we are talking about appropriate speed. Again, we want to make sure it's appropriate. There are plenty of times when you are reading a story that you actually don't need to speed up. You want it to be nice and slow. You want the reading rate to sound like you are talking. That is kind of the goal we want to give our students. We never want them to think about, oh, I need to read faster. We just need to read like we're talking. And then under expression, we have many more things. We have how students phrase words. We have prosody and intonation. We have how they read different punctuation and how they stress different words in a sentence. So you can see that there are many different things that have to work together for a student to become a fluent reader. But again, the 3 main ones are accuracy, reading rate, and expression. Now, one last note before I go into my 3 tips for you, and I kind of mentioned it when I was talking about the 3 categories of teaching fluency, and that is just to emphasize that accuracy, again, does need to be first and foremost. In fact, there are some that argue that if you teach phonemic awareness and phonics in a systematic, sequential way, your students will naturally become more fluent readers as they learn to decode different texts, but that's not always assumed. There are some students that will become naturally fluent readers as they continue to progress through those skills, but because of all that's involved in becoming a fluent reader, just because we teach students to automatically decode new words doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to become fluent readers. So you do want to explicitly teach fluency to your students. So that being said, let's dive into those 3 tips. Now that we have a basic understanding of all that fluency entails, let's go over 3 different activities and tips that we can use in our classroom to help build fluency with our youngest learners. Now, all the tips I mentioned are going to focus on authentic fluency, and we have to remember that the end goal of reading is always comprehension. So with all 3 of these activities, we are going to have the following components. We are going to work with high quality texts. We are going to practice oral reading. We have to remember that when we are talking about fluency, this is not silent. All of these activities are going to be practiced through reading aloud. There will be teacher modeling and time for practice. There will also be timely feedback, and the activities will increase motivation. So we always want to keep those things in mind when we are practicing fluency with our students. All right, tip number 1 is going to be to scaffold your fluency, and a great way to do this is through blending lines. Keeping in mind that we are working with K-2 learners and that we need to focus on accuracy first, accuracy and automaticity, this is going to be a great way to build fluency with your youngest students. With blending lines, you are working on phonics-based decoding, so you want it to follow along your scope and sequence of what you're teaching students, but naturally built in within blending lines, you have students working on word fluency, then going to phrasing fluency, and then going to sentence fluency. Sometimes the phrasing part is not in there, but we do have a natural scaffold from words to sentences before we move on to longer passages. Now, this idea of scaffolding is nothing new. In fact, I've talked about it many times when sharing my one-page phonics interventions that look like this. I always mentioned how we start with the sound at the top, then we go to decoding the words in isolation before moving on to sentences. Now, knowing that we need to keep comprehension in mind, I also have a spot for students to pick one of the sentences and illustrate it in the box. And of course, since these are phonics interventions, I have a place for them to practice encoding as well. Now, while I've talked about that before, I also wanted to share another great activity for helping students build up their fluency with these skills, and that is through blending lines. So here's an example of what this looks like. You can find many different examples of blending lines online, but here's just an example from the SJT Literacy Club. By the time this video is up, I may have these already out on TPT as well for purchase. I will go ahead and link them down in the description. But you can see up here we have the first 3 lines are students practicing the skill within words in isolation. And based on some of Wiley Blevin's work, you can also see that these are set up in a pretty purposeful way. The entire page is focusing on CVC words with the medial vowel A. And the first line works on initial sound substitution. So we have sat, mat, cat, map, tap, cap, dad, pad. So here students are reading strings of words, and you can see that many of them have the same rhyme at the end, but they change that initial phoneme for students to practice. And then when students go to line 2, again, we have a bunch more CVC words with that medial vowel A, but here we are actually changing the final phoneme. We're changing that last letter. We have cat, cap, hat, had, map, mat, sad, sat. And then, as you may have guessed, line 3 is going to do that same thing, but it's going to change that middle phoneme. So here I'm only working with short A and short E, as that is what students will have been introduced to at this point. But most of the words here are going to focus on that A. As students progress through those blending lines and progress through different skills, the endings, the beginnings, and the middles are all going to change based on what they already know. So it'll be built-in review as well. Moving on to lines 4 and 5, here we just have some quick phrases with the target skill in them. So these aren't necessarily going to be sentences, they aren't necessarily going to make complete sense. They might be parts of a sentence, they are going to just be phrases. So we have the fat cat, had red bag, a pet sat, a red cap, pat the mat, set the map. And you can see that all of the words students are decoding, other than a few high frequency words that they will have already learned, are in the first 3 lines. So again, you're scaffolding that fluency for students. These phrases are a great way for students to practice scooping the words together as they read, because again, while these aren't complete sentences, they may be part of a complete sentence later on. And then lines 6 and 7 are complete sentences, again, using the words from lines 1, 2, and 3, as well as some high frequency words that your students will already know. The dad pet the cat, a red map was in the bag. That's just one example of what blending lines look like in your classroom, but again, they are great to scaffold from word fluency to phrase fluency and then to sentence fluency. So when thinking about those components of authentic fluency, we do want to remember that this is not the type of activity to just print out with your students, pass it to them independently, and have them read in their head. And that wouldn't be great for a few different reasons. Number 1, we know that our students need to read these words aloud to practice their fluency, and also they need some modeling and practice with corrective feedback. So instead of just passing out the sheet for students to complete on their own, you may want to put it up on the smartboard, and you want to model reading this with your students. Now I'm going to talk about this in tip 2, but there are a few different ways you can do that. You can do that by echo reading, so I'm going to read some of the words, you're going to repeat after me. You can do that with choral reading, so you're all reading it together. And you can do this with partner reading, so maybe one person reads one word, one reads the next, or you split it up by lines, however you'd like to do that. But this way your students are hearing proper modeling, they are practicing it aloud, and you can give feedback as you listen to your students read these. If there's a few words or a few phrases that, all your students start to get quiet towards, or they're not as confident when they're saying it, that's a good one to practice with your students to build up that fluency. After you've done it whole group, the next day maybe you pass out the paper so students have it in front of them. And then again, you can still display it on the board, but ask them to make sure with their finger or some sort of tracker that they are following along with each word as they read it with you. All that to say that blending lines are a great way to really help your students go from phonics to fluency. All right, fluency tip number 2 is to practice fluency every day, and we can do that through whole group assisted reading practices. Now that might sound like one long fancy phrase, but it is basically what I mentioned earlier. The 3 main ways we can do this are through echo reading, choral reading, and partner reading. So let's talk a little bit about each. Now what's great about these assisted reading practices is that they can be implemented easily every day. It can be a quick activity that you're doing with your students, doesn't take up too much time. Like those blending lines I shared in tip number 1, that entire activity going through that doesn't really take more than 5 minutes. And that's going to be the same with these types of practices as well. But these practices can also be used with a variety of quality texts. We know that we need to choose quality text for our students to really develop this authentic fluency. So that might look like a decodable text where the entire class is working on a new skill and you have a passage with that skill highlighted in it that your students are going to work on. You might want to pass out a copy of that, or maybe just a small portion of that. Maybe it's a page in a longer text. Again, this is kind of up to you, but you want to make sure that the text is engaging and is also going to allow students to have that automaticity, so it should be something that they can mostly read. And I say mostly to remind you that your texts don't need to be 100% decodable. For more info on that, check out this video that I did all about decodable texts. Because again, with authentic learning, we might have some story words or vocabulary words that you want to pre-teach first before going into this activity. And that is totally fine as long as you point them out to students before you read. But most of the text should be decodable for them to work on this. So once you've picked a quality text to use with your students, here are the 3 main assisted reading practices. We have echo reading first, and just like it sounds, your students are going to be an echo. This is a great time for you to model what fluency is going to sound like with the particular passage you picked out. There may be different things in there, like different punctuation that you're going to focus on, and they can hear what that should sound like when they see an ellipsis, for example, in their text. Echo reading is going to be most beneficial during the initial presentation of a text. So the first time you give the text to your students, we will practice echo reading it. The second assisted reading activity is going to be choral reading. Now with choral reading, you and your students are all trying to read together. This is really going to assist them and help them as they decode the words to make sure that their voice is sounding like yours as they read aloud, which means that they're reading at the appropriate rate and they're stopping at the right pauses when they're supposed to. If you're working with higher students, you may want to begin with choral reading, but in most K-2 classrooms, I really like to start with the echo read, and then maybe the next day we get the passage and we all choral read it together, and then we move on to the third assisted reading practice, which is partner reading. Now, partner reading or paired reading can be done many different ways. Often it is most successful if you actually go ahead and purposely pair up your students. So to do that, you may want to rank them from number 1 to 20, maybe doesn't matter which end you start at, but 1 being your highest reader, and then going along to your lowest reader in terms of proficiency. And then when pairing up your students, you kind of want to cut that list in the middle and pair students up that way. So you are pairing your number 1 student, your highest reader, with the student in the middle of the class. You're not pairing your highest and your lowest. Because essentially you want to create a partnership where one student is a better reader, a stronger, more skilled reader, but you don't want the gap to be so big that they are doing all of the work. And just to point out, depending on your grade level, you may have some students, if they are too low of readers, then paired reading would not be beneficial for them. If, for example, we are doing a decodable text that our entire class is working on with long vowel EE and EA, this is just random, but let's pretend you're doing that, but you have a student that is still working on short vowels. They are not going to be able to access that text in a partner or paired reading type of way. So that would be a good time to pull that student or a couple of those students where that falls. They can come work with you during this time while the rest do this paired reading activity. And of course, you'd want to teach your students how to do this paired reading, and that you will explain to them that we are going to read the text. They will have already read this before, hopefully by echo reading and by choral reading already. And then they're going to read it aloud together. And the goal is always to, of course, help our classmates and coach them along as needed. So we can tell them that we're listening for appropriate pace. We don't want to read too fast or too slow. If we get stuck on a word, we can ask our partner for help. And depending on the passage, you can have students read line by line. They might read page by page as they're older, and you do this, for a larger book. Many times in K-2, we're kind of working with a paragraph at a time. So they line by line usually works best, but then you can also have students practice choral reading it together. When they choral read it together, they have that higher student kind of being the mentor, the model. And again, that higher student has already heard your modeling at least 2 times now, so they're probably even stronger reading that passage. So with tip 2, we want to model and practice fluency every single day, and 3 great ways to do that are through echo reading, choral reading, and partner reading. All right, tip number 3 is hopefully something you realized was kind of intertwined with tip 1 and tip 2, but that is, in order for your students to become authentic fluent readers, they need to read a text repeatedly. Researchers have known for a long time that repeated reading of the same text really helps promote fluency. It's also well researched that repeated reading of a text also helps promote comprehension. Many times, especially with our youngest learners who are still learning to decode, the first time they read a text, they spend so much energy just decoding what the words say that they aren't necessarily understanding it as they read it. So that's why we give them that initial reading so they can read, decode what the words say, then they need to read it again. As they read it again, they understand what is actually happening in the text. And like I mentioned in tip 1 and tip 2, with the blending lines, that's something you could repeat each day with the same blending line. You could do this as like a phonics warm-up. So again, they are reading it and decoding it first on the first day, they're practicing it with you, and then they might do that through echo reading. And then the next day they take it out and we read the same text through choral reading. Then on the 3rd day, we take out those blending lines again. I pass them to partners and I say, okay, you're gonna pair up. Let's do that line by line, help each other out. But again, they are reading the same text repeatedly. I just want to mention a few quick things in regards to repeated readings. Number 1, repeated readings are really only beneficial for students who are accurate at decoding, but are slow readers. We know that with fluency, accuracy is at the top because if your students cannot accurately decode what they're reading, then yes, of course, they're not going to become fluent in it. On the flip side, you may have 1 or 2 students who is going to get a brand new text, especially if it's a decodable one and they are a more advanced reader. And they may read through it fluently the very first time. Now, you really want to make sure that they are actually reading it fluently, not too fast, not too slow. Do they understand what they're reading? Is their intonation and prosody correct? So you do want to make sure you're monitoring those things, but you may have a student or 2 that, if that is the case, and they read it through fluently the first time, a repeated reading might not be beneficial for them. You might want to find a different text for them to use. Another note to mention about repeated readings is that you do want to make sure your students are not memorizing the text, especially if they are reading it a few times. If the text is too simple for them, or if you're just noticing that their eyes are not on the text as they're actually reading it, you want to make sure you give them corrective feedback to actually look through, make sure they're following the words and decoding as they're trying to be fluent readers. Some great activities to use with repeated readings include readers theater and poetry. Now, readers theater and poetry, again, have been used for fluency for a very long time. They are naturally a more motivating thing for students to read. Poetry because of the sing-songy type prosody that it has as you read it. And readers theater, of course, because you get to actually put on a performance. And students want to make sure that they are actually reading the same text over and over again. Again, you want to avoid them actually memorizing it. You want to have them have their script up there. They can read it enough times to become fluent with it. With poetry, you do want to make sure your students are reading the text aloud. Again, remember, all of this work is going to be done done orally, not silently. So you want students to practice reading that poem aloud. You might want to practice having them read it to a partner, and you can even have them practice reading the poem aloud in the same way you would with a reader's theater. So you may have a group of students all work on one poem. They can get up there and try to read it together, read it chorally, and perform it for the class. All right, there you have 3 tips to take your students from phonics to fluency. I hope you enjoyed these tips. Just to recap them real quickly, number 1 is that we want to scaffold our fluency from words to phrases and to sentences. Number 2 is we want to practice fluency every single day through assisted reading practices. And number 3, we want to make sure we are having our students use repeated readings of a text. Now, for those of you that are in the SJT Literacy Club, I do have an entire section on fluency. I have some role and race sheets here where students are working on individual word fluency as well as letter naming fluency. I have these roll, read, and find fluency sheets where students are working on reading a word quickly, but then also making sure they know what it actually says. So they have to find the matching image over here. Again, these are all phonics based. And then I also have these fluency phrases for students to work on, which again are phonics based and work through a sequential scope and sequence. And also the blending lines I mentioned in tip 1 are also included in that same section over in the SJT Literacy Club. You can see more about where to find them down in the description. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.